January 16, 1943, Portland Harbor, Oregon. The morning was calm and cold, the water, a perfect mirror beneath a pale gray sky. Dock workers moved slowly through the fog, their breath turning to mist, as they prepared another Liberty ship for inspection. The SS Schenectady had been launched only weeks earlier, fresh from the Kaiser shipyards, a gleaming symbol of American industrial might. She was the product of a miracle ships built faster than ever before, welded, instead of riveted, assembled like cars rolling off an assembly line. But as the sun rose over the harbor, that miracle was about to turn into a nightmare. At 11:15 a.m., a sharp metallic crack echoed across the docks. It sounded like a gunshot, then another, then a chorus of tearing steel. Within seconds, the SS Schenectady's massive hull began to bend. Witnesses later said it looked like the ship was breathing. The deck plates rippled as if alive, then split open with a deafening roar. A fracture raced from bow to stern in a single terrifying moment, slicing through the ship like an invisible knife. Men shouted and scrambled for safety as the vessel tore itself apart at the dock. When the noise stopped, the Schenectady was no longer a ship. She was two halves of twisted steel, her keel broken, her deck hanging like torn paper over the black water. There had been no storm, no explosion, no torpedo. The ship had simply cracked in half while tied to the pier. It made no sense. Investigators gathered within hours. Engineers crawled across the wreck, their boots clanging on cold metal. The fractures were smooth, almost surgical, as if the steel had shattered rather than torn. Theories poured in: bad welds, cheap steel design flaws, sabotage. But none of them explained why the ship had failed so violently and why it wasn't the first. Because the Schenectady was only the latest casualty in a growing list. In the previous months, Liberty ships around the world had begun splitting apart without warning. The SS John P. Gaines had snapped in half in calm seas off Alaska, her crew thrown into the freezing Pacific. The T-2 tanker SS Manhattan had fractured so suddenly, her sailors abandoned ship in panic, convinced they had been torpedoed. Between 1943 and 1944, more than 2,500 ships reported serious structural failures, cracks in their hulls, decks, splitting open steel plates, shearing like glass. 19 ships broke completely in two. 3 simply vanished at sea, leaving only oil slicks and debris. These were not enemy kills, they were self-destruction ships committing suicide. And every one of them had been built the same way, welded fast and mass-produced. To understand the scale of the problem, one had to understand what the Liberty ship represented. After Pearl Harbor, the United States faced an impossible logistics crisis. It needed cargo ships, hundreds of them, to carry weapons, food, and fuel across 2 oceans. Traditional shipbuilding took 8 months for a single vessel. That was too slow for total war. So industrialist Henry Kaiser, a man who had never built a ship before, promised something revolutionary: mass-produced cargo ships built like cars, assembled in weeks instead of months. Kaiser's idea worked, at least at first. By late 1942, his shipyards were launching Liberty ships every 42 days. Propaganda films celebrated the miracle of American industry. Women welders replaced male riveters who had gone to war sparks, flying beneath banners that read, "Speed wins wars." And for a moment it seemed true. But speed had a cost that no one understood yet. In the frozen waters of the North Atlantic, where temperatures plunged below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, Liberty ships began to fail in strange ways. The welded hulls that saved so much time in production were behaving differently than the old riveted ones. Small cracks that should have stopped at a seam were instead racing unchecked across entire hulls, devouring steel in seconds. The very process that made the ships fast to build was making them fatally brittle. Sailors began to fear the vessels meant to save them. Some refused to sleep below deck, terrified of being trapped if the hull gave way in the night. Others spoke of hearing eerie pings echoing through the steel like the sound of glass under strain, just hours before disaster struck. Engineers called it superstition, but the superstitions were multiplying because the cracks were real. By the end of 1943, the Liberty ship program, once America's greatest industrial triumph, was turning into a national embarrassment. Each fracture wasn't just a ship lost. It was a logistical artery, severed a blow to the war effort, measured in thousands of tons of cargo and hundreds of lives. Yet no one could explain it. The press called it the mystery of the breaking ships. In Washington, congressional committees demanded answers. Naval architects blamed the welders. The welders blamed the steel mills. The steel mills blamed the designers. And while they argued, more ships broke apart in the night. The miracle that had carried America's hopes across the sea was cracking under its own success. And in a shipyard in California, under flickering lamps and clouds of welding smoke, a woman no one had ever heard of was about to see what all the experts had missed. Henry Kaiser had promised that he could do the impossible. In 1941, when the U.S. Maritime Commission approached him about building cargo ships, most of Washington's shipbuilding establishment laughed. Kaiser was a dam builder, not a naval architect. He had poured concrete at Hoover Dam, not riveted steel in a dry dock. But Kaiser didn't believe in doing things the traditional way. "We'll build them like cars," he told reporters, "factories on the water." And when America's entry into war turned the ocean into a battlefield, he delivered on that promise with breathtaking speed. At his shipyards in Richmond, California, and Portland, Oregon, construction looked nothing like the shipbuilding of the past. Gone were the slow rhythms of riveters hammering red-hot bolts into cooling plates. Instead, giant prefabrication sheds produced entire sections of hulls ready to be welded together. Sparks rained from scaffolds day and night. Conveyor belts carried supplies from steel mills directly into assembly lines. Floodlights turned midnight into noon. The pace was biblical. Ships that had once taken 8 months to build were now rolling off the line in 40 days or less. One ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, was completed from keel to launch in 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes. Newspapers called it the ship that beat the clock. The world called it a miracle. But in every miracle, there's a flaw hidden beneath the glory. The Liberty ship was an engineering compromise designed for speed, not longevity. It wasn't built to last 20 years. It only had to survive the war. Riveting the traditional method required precision and time. Welding was faster. It also saved weight and allowed simpler construction. But welding introduced new kinds of stress no one fully understood. Unlike riveted joints, which acted as natural crack stoppers, welded seams created continuous sheets of metal from bow to stern. That continuity was strong under compression, but terrifyingly fragile under tension. In California's mild climate, the problem was invisible. The ships launched in Richmond sailed smoothly out of the bay, their welded hulls gleaming under the sun. But in the cold Atlantic, things were different. At temperatures near freezing, the steel lost its ductility, its ability to bend instead of break. A small imperfection, a sharp corner, even the faintest microscopic flaw could become the starting point of catastrophe. And the way Kaiser's shipyards were building these vessels made the flaws inevitable. Welding replaced the old teams of riveters with small crews of electric welders, many of them women new to industrial work. They were fast, precise, and proud. Propaganda posters called them Rosie the Riveter, though in truth they were welders now. These women worked 16-hour shifts under clouds of smoke and heat, their masks glowing blue. Every shipyard bulletin board carried the same slogan, "Speed is the best armor." It was the gospel of the war economy. Speed meant victory. Speed meant freedom. Speed also meant mistakes. Each Liberty ship was assembled from hundreds of welded sections, but no one had established a standard welding sequence. Crews often welded long seams from one end to the other in a single pass. When the metal cooled, it contracted unevenly. The surrounding plate, still hot, resisted the pull-locking residual stress deep into the structure. Every finished weld trapped a little more strain. By the time a ship was completed, its hull carried millions of invisible pounds of tension coiled like a spring, waiting for the right conditions to snap. Yet no one saw it that way in 1942. To the public, Kaiser's shipyards were monuments to progress. Newsreels showed smiling women in coveralls, sparks flying as swing music played in the background. The message was clear: America had turned its industrial might into a weapon. Henry Kaiser himself became a national hero, the man who had solved the logistics crisis. When President Roosevelt visited the Richmond Yard, he called it proof that democracy can outproduce tyranny. And then the cracks began. At first, they were minor, thin hairlines near deck hatches or cargo openings. The engineers dismissed them as surface imperfections, but the cracks kept growing. Some ships reported sudden pops during voyages, the sound of steel plates releasing tension. Others developed leaks around the seams where welded joints met sharp corners. In late 1942, entire hull sections began splitting apart. The failures came without warning, without enemy fire, without storms. Crews described it as if the ship itself was alive and tearing apart from within. Naval investigators swarmed the yards. They blamed unskilled labor, bad welding rods, poor supervision. Orders came down to double-check every seam, to retrain workers to reinforce the hulls. But nothing stopped the failures. Each investigation produced new theories and new confusion. Metallurgists analyzed samples of the steel and found nothing wrong. The alloy met every specification. The welds passed inspection. The numbers all said the ships should have been strong. Yet they weren't. Behind the numbers, fear was spreading. In letters home, sailors wrote about the cursed ships. Dock workers whispered that the Liberty hulls were haunted. Some ship captains refused to sail certain vessels. The Maritime Commission began quietly altering design details, adding reinforcing straps, modifying hatch corners, even experimenting with riveted joints again. But the pace of production couldn't slow down. America was fighting on two oceans. The Allies needed ships, not theories. By 1943, the problem had reached crisis level. Two ships had broken apart in harbor conditions. The press began asking questions. Kaiser's miracle was in danger of collapsing under its own ambition. The government called for expert panels, committees, metallurgical reviews. They found nothing conclusive. For all their education and instruments, the experts couldn't see what was happening inside the steel. And in one of Kaiser's shipyards, working the graveyard shift surrounded by sparks and darkness, a single welder was beginning to notice something the engineers never did. Night after night, she watched the metal move, the seams warp, the plates twist slightly under her torch. The others ignored it. She didn't. She didn't have a degree. She didn't need one. She could feel it in her hands. The ships were being built wrong. Long before history remembered her name, Bessie Hamill was just another welder in the sea of overalls and sparks at Richmond Shipyard No. 3. The night shift started at 10:00 p.m. and ended when the horizon began to glow pale gray over San Francisco Bay. The air was thick with smoke, heavy with the scent of molten flux and hot steel. Rows of Liberty ships loomed in the dark, their skeletal frames rising like cathedrals of iron under the floodlights. To most workers, the noise and heat were endless. An industrial symphony played to the rhythm of war. To Bessie, it was alive. She had been there for 8 months, long enough to know the sound of a good weld from a bad one. A clean seam hummed with a steady pitch. A stressed joint rang sharper, higher, like a violin string pulled too tight. At first she ignored it. The foreman said it didn't matter, that small distortions were part of the process. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The steel plates they welded each night, massive rectangles 20 feet long and an inch thick, were warping in strange patterns. When they cooled, they didn't lie flat. They bowed slightly inward, as though the metal itself was fighting against its own shape. Most welders learn to compensate by brute force, hammer the plates into place, clamp harder, weld faster. Bessie did the opposite. She stopped to watch. Each time she laid a seam, she marked how the steel moved. She began keeping a notebook in her lunch pail, sketching crude diagrams of plates twisting and buckling, the sequence of heat zones, the order her team followed. She saw a pattern forming, one that had nothing to do with luck or bad steel. Every shift followed the same sequence. Welders started at the edges and worked toward the center, or ran long, continuous seams in a straight line from one end of the plate to the other. Each cooling weld contracted, pulling the surrounding metal, tighter, locking tension into the structure. By the time the next seam was added, the stress was already trapped. It was like tightening the center bolts on a wheel before securing the outer ones, a recipe for imbalance and failure. She tried to tell her foreman. He laughed. "The engineers know what they're doing. You just run your torch and keep it straight." When she pressed the issue, he told her to mind her quota, 20 feet of seam per hour. But Bessie couldn't unsee what she'd seen. The steel was talking to her, and she was the only one listening. The more she observed, the more she realized how blind the process had become. Welders were rewarded for speed, not precision. Supervisors timed each section by stopwatch, not by stress distribution. The blueprints handed down from the engineering office dictated where to weld, not when or how. The people designing the ships had never stood under one, never felt the plates vibrate as they cooled. They worked from numbers. She worked from sound heat and instinct. One night in November 1943, after her shift ended, she stayed behind in the yard. The floor was littered with scrap steel cutouts, test pieces, discarded sections. She borrowed a few and welded them together in different sequences, edge to center, center to edge, alternating sides. When they cooled, she measured the curvature with a straight edge. The plates welded from the edges first bent upward, like warped wood. The plates welded from the center outward stayed flat. The difference was unmistakable. The next morning she showed her samples to her foreman. He glanced at them, shrugged, and walked away. "You're a welder, not an engineer," he said. "Don't waste company material." But Bessie wasn't done. She spent her next 2 weekends running her own experiments, marking the temperature drop between passes with chalk, noting how stress built up near corners and openings. She realized the problem wasn't the material, it was the sequence. The engineers had created a system that guaranteed internal tension in every ship they built. Word spread among the night shift. Some thought she was wasting her time. Others quietly agreed. "Those plates are fighting back," one welder said. "I've seen them pop like rifle shots." But no one dared question management. The war effort had no room for doubt. Production was patriotism. Delay was disloyalty. Still, she couldn't let it go. Each time a ship cracked, she saw the faces of the men who had welded it, the thousands of hours spent under fire and smoke, the pride that turned to shame when the newspapers printed headlines about the ships that broke themselves. It wasn't their fault. It was the process. And if she didn't say something, no one would. So she did the unthinkable. In November 1943, she requested a meeting with her supervisors, an official challenge to the engineering department's procedures. It was a violation of the chain of command that could have gotten her fired. When they asked what the meeting was about, she wrote a single line on the form: "Stress from improper welding sequence causing hull failure." The supervisors arrived expecting a complaint. What they got was a demonstration. Bessie laid her test plates on the table, explaining what she'd seen, how heat moved through steel, how the contraction of each seam built up tension that couldn't escape. She showed how a different order, starting in the center and alternating sides, released that stress outward. She didn't use equations or jargon. She used the language of someone who had lived inside the problem. They dismissed her politely. One man called her theory impractical. Another said the distortion came from cheap steel. But one supervisor, an older man named Charles Horton, lingered after the others left. He'd been in shipbuilding long enough to know that sometimes the smallest details made the biggest difference. He asked to see her weld. That night, Horton stood beside her as she worked. He watched how the plate shifted, how she paused between passes to let the metal relax, how the seam cooled evenly instead of curling upward. When the section was finished, it lay flat on the bench. Horton said nothing for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "Do that again." It was the beginning of the experiment that would rewrite how America built its ships, and the night a welder's so-called ridiculous idea began to prove every expert wrong. By late November 1943, the rumors had begun to spread quietly across the Richmond yards. Someone on the night shift had challenged the official welding procedure. Supervisors called it a distraction. Engineers dismissed it as shop talk. Yet within days, her name was on everyone's lips. The welder with the ridiculous idea. To the men running Kaiser's empire, the claim sounded absurd. The Liberty ship program had been studied, audited, and inspected by the finest metallurgists and naval architects in the country. Washington had held hearings. Universities had written papers. How could a single woman with a torch claim to see what thousands of engineers had missed? But Charles Horton, the supervisor who had seen Bessie's demonstration, wasn't laughing. He ordered a controlled test. They began in a corner of Yard 3 out of sight from the production lines. Bessie and her small team of welders worked with 2 identical steel panels, each 12 feet long and 2 inches thick. One would be welded using the standard method edges, first continuous seams, quick passes to meet the quota. The other would follow her sequence, start in the center, alternate sides weld outward in balanced sections, never allowing any one area to overheat. The observers included Horton, 2 metallurgists, and a young engineer with a clipboard full of skepticism. The difference was visible before the welds had even cooled. The first plate twisted upward along its center line, the edges buckling slightly as the heat pulled inward. The second stayed flat, only a faint ripple visible in the reflection of the floodlight. When they measured the distortion, it was less than half of the standard panels. Horton frowned. "Again," he said. They repeated the process with thicker plates, longer seams, more complex joints. Each time the results were the same. Within a week, the metallurgists joined the experiment. They installed strain gauges to measure residual stress, the invisible tension locked into steel as it cooled. When the readings came back, the numbers stunned everyone in the room. Traditional weld sequences left stress concentrations of over 30,000 pounds per square inch near hatch corners and deck edges. Bessie's sequence distributed that stress across broader zones, rarely exceeding 12,000 psi. The difference wasn't theoretical. It was measurable. The young engineer looked at the printout and whispered, "That's impossible." Horton answered, "It's happening anyway." Word reached Henry Kaiser's office before the end of the week. For months he had been fighting political pressure over the Liberty ship failures. The Maritime Commission wanted answers. Congress wanted scapegoats. Now, in a single test bay, an untrained welder had provided both a problem and a solution. Kaiser requested a full briefing. Bessie's samples were brought to the main yard, where a formal demonstration took place under strict supervision. Metallurgists from the University of California examined the plates measuring stress patterns and microfractures under magnification. When they applied pressure tests, the standard welds began to crack along familiar lines, the same fractures that had doomed ships at sea. The ridiculous welds held. That night, Kaiser sat in his office surrounded by reports, production schedules, and cost charts. Stopping the line now would mean halting the miracle of mass production. 90,000 workers, 24-hour shifts, hundreds of subcontractors, all built around speed. Changing the welding sequence meant retraining every welder, rewriting every assembly manual, redesigning every section of every ship. It would slow production when the Navy needed ships most. But the data didn't lie. The Liberty ship failures weren't random. They were systematic. They were built into the process itself. Kaiser didn't hesitate long. He gave the order, "Stop the line, start again, retrain them all." For a man who had built his reputation on speed, it was the most radical decision he could have made. Overnight, his shipyards transformed from assembly lines into classrooms. Experienced welders were pulled from the production floor to become instructors. Each received a new set of diagrams, Bessey's diagrams, showing how to sequence welds from the center outward, alternating sides, never running continuous seams longer than 4 feet without a break. The new method even had a name, now balanced welding sequence. It was by every industrial measure an act of madness. Production dropped by 30% in the first week. Critics called it proof that Kaiser's miracle had been a fluke all along. Congressional investigators circled ready to pounce. Newspapers reported training disruptions and schedule delays. Inside the yards, morale wavered, but in the test bays, the results kept coming. Engineers began to understand the physics behind the change. Steel wasn't solid in the way people imagined. It was a crystalline structure, its molecules expanding under heat and contracting as they cooled. When welders ran a continuous line, the hot zone expanded faster than the surrounding cold steel, creating tension that had nowhere to go. Once the weld cooled, that tension remained locked inside an invisible ticking bomb. In warm climates, the steel could absorb it. In cold seas, the crystals lost their flexibility, becoming brittle. A tiny crack at a hatch corner could turn into a chain reaction, traveling the entire length of a hull at nearly the speed of sound. The solution was elegant and simple: let the steel breathe. By welding from the center outward, the metal could release its stress gradually toward the edges. Alternating sides kept heat distribution symmetrical. Short, staggered welds prevented localized buildup. The process didn't require new equipment, new materials, or more manpower, only a new rhythm, one that followed the natural laws of heat and contraction instead of fighting them. By December 1943, the first full-scale hull section welded under the new procedure was completed. When the test team applied stress loads, simulating rough Atlantic seas, the section held perfectly. No distortion, no micro cracks, no audible ping of strain. The engineers were forced to admit it, the ridiculous idea worked. Kaiser's next decision turned it from a local experiment into a revolution. He ordered the redesign of his next generation of ships, the Victory class, to incorporate every lesson from the Liberty ship failures. The new ships would feature rounded hatch corners instead of square ones to eliminate stress concentrations. Their hulls would be built in smaller modular sections to allow precise control of welding sequences. The steel itself would change a refined alloy with slightly less carbon, more manganese, and a trace of nickel to maintain toughness in cold water. It was a sweeping transformation of industrial philosophy, triggered not by a scientist or an admiral, but by a woman who refused to ignore the sound of bending steel. In January 1944, as new welders learned the center-out method on practice plates, the older ones scoffed. They called it superstition, a waste of time. But within weeks, the skeptics began to see the difference. The plates no longer warped, the seams cooled cleanly, the familiar creaks and groans of stressed hulls disappeared. For the first time in months, the shipyard was quiet in a way that felt safe. The first Victory ship built with the new sequence would take shape within weeks. It would not only prove Bessie Hamel's insight, but redefine how every nation on Earth would weld steel for the next century. The ridiculous idea had become the foundation of modern shipbuilding. By February 1944, the Richmond shipyards no longer sounded like chaos. The roar of welding torches and the clanging of steel were still there, but now they followed a rhythm, a new, almost musical sequence of steps and pauses. The yards had become something else entirely, part classroom, part laboratory, part factory. 90,000 workers, welders, fitters, machinists, electricians were learning a new language of steel, one written by a woman who still punched a night shift time card. Henry Kaiser's gamble to halt production had been a public relations disaster at first. Reporters mocked him. Politicians called it industrial suicide. The Navy fretted about lost tonnage when Allied offensives were only months away. But Kaiser didn't flinch. Speed without strength is nothing, he told his supervisors. We're not building coffins, we're building lifelines. In every shed, posters appeared with a new slogan, "Center out, never in." Each welder received a laminated card printed with numbered weld sequences for their assigned sections. Before striking the first arc, they had to trace the sequence with a gloved finger. Instructors like Bessie Hamill, now reluctantly promoted to trainer, walked the rows, watching the timing, checking the heat, ensuring that each plate cooled evenly before the next pass. For every 10 welds, the plate was placed in a stress relief oven, heated to over 2,000 degrees, then allowed to cool slowly overnight. What had once been a frantic assembly race became a choreography of precision. At first, the process seemed painfully slow. Ships that had once been launched in 42 days now took nearly twice that. Schedules fell behind. Supplies stacked up in the rail yards. Skeptics whispered that Kaiser had lost his edge. But then something remarkable happened. The errors vanished. Hull sections that had required rework were now fitting perfectly on the first try. Weld rejection rates dropped from 15% to 3%. Every completed joint passed inspection. When test plates were struck with hammers or chilled in tanks of ice water, they stayed intact. The stress had vanished. The first full Victory-class hull assembled under the new system came together in March 1944. It was a prototype, a test ship not meant for service, but the results were beyond anything expected. The hull showed 0 microcracks under ultrasonic scans. Its structure was so true that the engineers nicknamed it the straight ship. Kaiser called it proof of concept. Washington called it luck. Kaiser answered, "Then let's see if luck can be repeated." He ordered Yard 2 to begin preparing for full-scale Victory ship production using the new modular system. Unlike Liberty ships, which had been built upward from a central keel, the Victory ships would be assembled like puzzles, massive prefabricated blocks welded separately, then joined in a single synchronized operation. Each block had its own sequence card, its own team, its own timetable. A bow section, for example, consisted of 50 smaller sub-assemblies, bottom plates, bulkheads, deck frames, all welded center outward, balanced, stress-relieved, and precision measured before final joining. Inside the covered prefabrication sheds, the process looked more like an automotive plant than a shipyard. Conveyors rolled sections from one station to the next. Overhead cranes lifted completed modules into massive alignment jigs. Teams rotated through stations in timed intervals, 30 minutes of welding, 10 minutes of rest, 5 minutes of inspection. A central control tower tracked every operation with chalkboards and clocks logging progress in real time. If one section lagged, others adjusted instantly. To the untrained eye, it looked mechanical. To those who understood, it was alive steel breathing in perfect rhythm. On May 12, 1944, Richmond Yard 2 prepared for its most ambitious test yet. 17 prefabricated modules, representing nearly 85% of a completed hull, were aligned and lowered into position. Gantry cranes swung overhead, dropping each block with precision measured in inches. Sparks burst along the seams as hundreds of welders began connecting the modules, each following the same center-out sequence Bessie had pioneered. The operation lasted 11 hours. By dawn, the skeleton of a Victory ship stood complete. For the next 5 days, the yard became a ballet of coordination. Electricians ran cables through pre-drilled conduits. Pipe fitters installed steam lines already measured and tagged. Painters moved behind them, sealing each section as soon as it cooled. The engine, already tested off-site, was lowered directly into place, its mounts aligning perfectly on the first try. Unlike the chaotic Liberty builds of the year before, there were no last-minute corrections, no warped plates, no emergency re-welds. Every measurement fit like a key in a lock. At precisely 5:11 a.m., on June 27, 1944, the hull of the SS Benjamin Warner slid into the water. The crowd that gathered along the pier was silent at first, as if afraid the ship might betray them like the Liberty ships had. But the Warner floated straight and level, her hull lines gleaming under the morning light. When she completed her sea trials 2 days later, without a single stress crack, the silence turned into thunderous applause. 5 days and 11 hours from keel, laying to sea trials. A record not of reckless speed, but of perfection through precision. Kaiser's team called it the 5-day miracle. The press ran headlines declaring shipyards reborn. Washington called off its investigations. The Maritime Commission issued new orders for 500 Victory ships using the same construction model. Even the skeptics in the Navy's Bureau of Ships conceded that Kaiser had achieved something no one had thought possible, combining mass production with structural integrity. But behind the statistics, there was something deeper. The 5-day miracle wasn't just an engineering triumph. It was a transformation of mindset. For the first time, industrial America understood that quality and speed were not enemies. They were partners when built on process, not pressure. The balance sequence proved that discipline could outperform desperation. For Bessie Hamill, it was a strange victory. Her name never appeared in the reports. The documents credited a revised welding methodology developed at Richmond Shipyard. She was still just a shift supervisor, still punching her cards, still welding when needed. But the men who had once laughed now saluted when she walked by. They called her Boss Bess. The ships that followed carried that unseen legacy across 2 oceans. The Victory fleet became the backbone of Allied logistics, carrying tanks to Normandy fuel to Okinawa and food to liberated Europe. Not one of them ever broke in half. Not one failed from brittle fracture. The design was so sound that many Victory ships would continue sailing for decades after the war, long after Liberty ships had rusted into memory. In the Richmond yards, someone painted a new phrase on the wall above the main gate. It wasn't a slogan. It was a truth carved into the soul of the workers who had seen the transformation firsthand. We slowed down to win. The 5-day miracle wasn't the triumph of speed, it was the redemption of patience. A nation obsessed with production had learned through a welder's ridiculous idea that true progress begins the moment you stop to listen to the sound of the steel. When the first Victory ships began crossing the Atlantic in late 1944, they carried more than cargo. They carried proof that the invisible science of stress, heat, and human observation could change the course of a war. The same forces that had destroyed the Liberty ships were still there: temperature, tension, fatigue. But this time they were understood, controlled, and harnessed. For the first time, engineers could explain in numbers and in physics why the new ships held together where others had failed. The breakthrough began with the steel itself. The Liberty ships had been made from a standard carbon-manganese alloy that performed well in mild climates, but failed catastrophically in cold seas. Below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, the steel's internal structure changed. What had once been ductile and flexible became brittle, its crystal lattice tightening, until it behaved less like metal and more like glass. A tiny flaw, perhaps no wider than a human hair, could trigger a fracture that raced through hundreds of feet of welded plate. To solve this, Kaiser's metallurgists designed a new alloy known as killed steel. The name was as brutal as the process. During smelting, aluminum was added to remove dissolved oxygen from the molten metal, killing its reactivity and preventing tiny gas bubbles that weakened the structure. Manganese levels were adjusted, and a trace of nickel, barely 0.25%, was added to increase low-temperature toughness. It was an expensive addition, but its effect was transformative. Tests at the University of California laboratories showed that the transition temperature, the point where the steel changed from ductile to brittle, had dropped from roughly 40 degrees Fahrenheit in the Liberty ship's alloy to just 5 degrees Fahrenheit. That 35-degree difference meant survival in the freezing North Atlantic, where seawater hovered just above the freezing point. In those conditions, Liberty steel shattered like porcelain. Victory steel flexed, absorbed the shock, and held firm. But metallurgy was only one half of the story. The other half was geometry, the way stress moved through the ship's body. The Liberty design had used square hatch openings and hard angled bulkhead connections because they were easy to cut and assemble. Unfortunately, those right angles became amplifiers of stress. When a wave bent the hull even slightly, the force at those corners multiplied 3 or 4 times the normal load. Combined with the residual stress from welding, they became ticking fracture points. The Victory redesign replaced every sharp corner with smooth curves. Rounded hatches distributed stress, evenly reducing the multiplier from 4 to less than 2. It seemed like a cosmetic change, an aesthetic flourish, but the numbers proved otherwise. A Liberty ship hitting a 40-foot wave might see local stress spikes exceeding 60,000 psi near a square hatch far beyond the steel's limit. The same wave hitting a Victory ship generated only 25,000 psi comfortably within safe range. Another unseen improvement lay in the ship's seams themselves. The Liberty ships had been fully welded from bow to stern, a single continuous structure. The design saved time, but created an unintended vulnerability. When a crack started, there was nothing to stop it. It could run the entire length of the hull uninterrupted. The Victory ships introduced a radical concept: deliberate imperfection. At strategic points, riveted joints replaced welded seams, creating mechanical crack arrestors. These joints acted like fire breaks in a forest. If a fracture began, it lost energy when it hit a riveted seam, stopping the propagation before it became catastrophic. The engineers called it defensive design, the idea that strength wasn't about perfection, but about forgiving failure. No structure is flawless forever, they argued. The key is ensuring that when it fails safely. Internally, the Victory ships were built like layered armor. Frames were doubled at critical stress zones. Bulkheads were spaced to align with the new welding sequence, so the natural expansion and contraction of steel followed predictable paths. Even the deck plate thicknesses were recalculated not to add brute strength, but to balance how stress traveled across the surface. The result was harmony between material method and motion. When the first stress tests were conducted at the Naval Materials Laboratory in 1944, the findings were staggering. Liberty-class test sections began cracking at stress levels around $32,000 psi. Victory-class sections endured up to $54,000 before showing microfractures, and even then those cracks stopped within inches, rather than running uncontrolled. At sea, those numbers translated into survival. Between June 1944 and the war's end in August 1945, 531 Victory ships entered service. Not one suffered a catastrophic hull failure. The Navy logged only minor surface cracks in a handful of vessels, each caught during routine inspections and repaired before spreading. The same period saw dozens of Liberty ships retired or lost to structural failure. The contrast was undeniable. The data didn't just vindicate Henry Kaiser's decision, it proved that Bessie Hamel's intuition had been right from the start. The issue had never been bad steel or sloppy labor. It was the silent physics of heat and contraction, multiplied by geometry and ignorance. The solution wasn't more force or faster work. It was balance and understanding that the steel itself needed time to breathe. As the war pushed deeper into the Pacific, the Victory ships became the backbone of Allied logistics. They sailed through Arctic convoys to Murmansk, endured typhoons in the South China Sea, and delivered supplies to Normandy under enemy fire. Their hulls flexed, shuddered, and groaned, but they did not break. Sailors who had once slept in fear now slept in confidence, knowing that their ship would hold. Engineers began referring to them as forgiving ships, vessels designed not just to perform, but to endure human error, storm, and time. And long after the war ended, their legacy would echo across industries far beyond the ocean. The same welding sequences were adopted for bridge construction, oil pipelines, and even the emerging field of nuclear power. The principle was universal control, the sequence control, the stress. Every skyscraper beam, every offshore platform, every pressure vessel built in the decades to come carried a piece of that discovery. By the time Victory Ship No. 500 launched in 1945, the mystery that had haunted shipbuilders for years was finally solved. The Liberty ships had cracked because their creators believed that strength came from rigidity. The Victory ships endured because their makers learned that strength comes from flexibility. Steel is alive. It moves, expands, contracts, resists, and remembers. And once you understand how it breathes, you can build anything to last. When the war ended in 1945, the shipyards fell silent for the first time in years. The great cranes stood motionless against the California sky, their hooks swaying in the wind over dry docks that no longer echoed with hammer strikes or welding torches. The Richmond yards had produced more than 700 ships during the war, a miracle of steel and sweat that helped turn the tide of history. But now, as peace returned, the people who had built that miracle drifted back to their lives unnoticed, uncelebrated, and mostly forgotten. Among them was Bessie Hamill. She clocked out one last time in the summer of 1946. There was no ceremony, no photograph, no newspaper clipping. Her final paycheck was folded neatly inside a brown envelope. She walked home through the quiet streets of the company town she had helped build and hung her gloves by the door. The war was over. Her work, as far as anyone knew, was done. For a while, even the engineers who had studied her method seemed to move on. The Victory ship program wound down, the yards closed, and the world turned its attention to new technologies, jet engines, atomic power, the dawn of the computer age. The Liberty ships that had survived were scrapped or sold to private companies. The Victory ships kept sailing quietly, doing their job. They carried grain to Europe under the Marshall Plan troops, to Korea, and supplies during the Cold War. Decades later, when the last of them was finally retired, inspectors noted something astonishing. After millions of miles and decades of service, their hulls still showed no catastrophic cracks. Bessie never knew it, but the method she had discovered had already outlived the war. In 1947, the American Welding Society published a new standard, the Structural Welding Code, a document that codified the best practices of the wartime shipyards. Buried deep within its technical language was a section describing the balanced welding sequence, complete with diagrams that mirrored the ones Bessie had drawn by hand 3 years earlier. It became mandatory for all critical structural welds in shipbuilding bridges and pressure vessels. The code did not name her. It never would. But her influence was everywhere. When engineers designed the Trans-Alaska Pipeline in the 1970s, 800 miles of welded steel carrying hot oil through sub-zero tundra, they relied on stress relief procedures born in the Richmond yards. When the Golden Gate Bridge underwent its seismic retrofit in the 1990s, the welding teams followed computer simulations based on the same center-outward principles. Even in the construction of nuclear reactors, where steel pressure vessels must endure both extreme heat and radiation, engineers used stress relief ovens nearly identical in concept to the ones Kaiser installed during the Victory program. Each of these modern marvels carried within it the ghost of a welder who refused to accept that's how it's done. In the decades after the war, historians wrote volumes about Henry Kaiser and his Industrial Revolution. They called him the father of mass production at sea. They wrote about his workers, his shipyards, his innovations. But Bessie Hamill's name rarely appeared. She lived quietly in Sacramento, working odd jobs, raising 2 children, never mentioning that she had once changed the way the world built its ships. When she died in 1987, her obituary was 3 sentences long. It mentioned that she had worked in wartime shipyards and enjoyed gardening. There was no hint that the welding code followed by every modern engineer carried her fingerprints. And yet her legacy endures in ways more lasting than any medal or monument. Every welder who lays a bead on a skyscraper column and follows the rule of center-out alternate sides is speaking her language. Every inspector who measures residual stress with an ultrasonic gauge is verifying her discovery. Every engineer who designs for flexibility instead of rigidity is walking the path she revealed. The story of the ridiculous welder is more than a tale of technical innovation. It's a reminder that progress doesn't always come from the top. Sometimes it comes from the hum of a night shift, the patience to listen, and the courage to say, "This isn't right." Bessie Hamel didn't invent welding metallurgy or engineering theory. What she gave the world was something simpler and rarer. She taught it how to listen. The same humility that defined her work defined the philosophy that grew from it. Modern engineering has a word for it now: feedback. The idea that the process itself can teach the designer that the hand holding the torch knows something the blueprint never will. From Toyota's lean production to NASA's fault-tolerant systems, the concept runs deep. Respect the worker, observe the process, and let reality correct theory. Those are the seeds planted by one woman's ridiculous question in a wartime shipyard. Today, a handful of preserved Victory ships still float in harbors around the world museums of steel and memory. Visitors walk their decks, read plaques about wartime production, and marvel at how these vessels survived where others failed. Most never notice the weld seams running along the hulls, smooth, evenly spaced, unbroken. But for anyone who listens closely, they whisper her story in the faint metallic echoes of the sea. We were built by someone who cared enough to ask why. If you believe ordinary people can change the course of history, comment 1. If you think great ideas only belong to engineers and leaders, hit like. But remember, every bridge you cross, every tower that stands, and every ship that sails owes a silent debt to a woman who refused to stop listening. And if you want to hear more untold stories of courage, genius, and stubborn hope from the forgotten corners of World War II, subscribe now. Because somewhere in every machine that moves and every structure that endures, there is another ridiculous idea waiting to be heard. May 1944. The Kansas sky was bright, thin, and mercilessly clear when the test pilot of a brand-new Boeing B-29 shouted through his headset, "Engine 2's on fire. I'm shutting her down." Moments later, a column of black smoke erupted from the wing. Flames spread along the nacelle, licking at the silver skin of the superfortress as it struggled to stay airborne. The pilot tried to feather the propeller, but the fire refused to die. The burning wing folded upward, and within seconds, the $4 million aircraft that symbolized America's technological supremacy broke apart in midair. The explosion was seen from 10 miles away. In the following months, that scene would repeat itself again and again over the plains of Kansas and Washington. These were not combat losses. No German shell or Japanese fighter had touched them. They were dying from within. The cause lay in the very heart of the aircraft, the Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engine. 18 cylinders, twin turbos, 200 horsepower, and a temper that could kill. Engineers called it a masterpiece with a death wish. When the war demanded rapid production, design compromises became time bombs. The R-3350's rear cylinders overheated so violently that even short test flights could ignite fuel vapors trapped inside the cowling. Pilots called them flying crematoriums. On paper, the B-29 was the most advanced bomber ever built. Pressurized cabins, remote-controlled gun turrets, a range of 3,000 miles. In reality, it was a machine balanced on the edge of catastrophe. Between 1943 and mid-1944, 57 B-29s were destroyed in peacetime tests and training flights. More than 100 crewmen died, killed not by the enemy, but by the engines meant to carry them into battle. Each crash brought the same horror fire, consuming aluminum oil igniting like napalm, and rescue crews arriving too late to find anything but melted fragments of what had been the future of American air power. The Air Force issued memoranda. Boeing sent engineers Wright Aeronautical promised improvements, yet the fires continued. In the hangars of Wichita, exhausted mechanics wiped oil and soot from their faces. and whispered the same question. How could the nation that built the Liberty ship, the Jeep, and the Mustang create a bomber that killed its own pilots? The answer no one dared to say aloud might be buried not in the engines, but in the paperwork somewhere in the maze of specifications, approvals, and signatures that turned innovation into paralysis. One young technician would later write in his notebook, "The airplane isn't dangerous. The way we build it is." His name would be forgotten in official histories, but his decision would change the war. He would defy orders, break military protocol, and risk a court-martial to fix what headquarters refused to acknowledge. His idea would be labeled unauthorized modification, an act forbidden under wartime regulations. Yet that same illegal idea would save hundreds of men from burning alive in their own aircraft. So before this story becomes technical, ask yourself a question. When a machine kills the men who fly it, who should take the blame, the engineers who designed it, or the officers who ignored those who tried to fix it? Comment 1 if you believe most wartime disasters start with human arrogance, not mechanical failure. Tap like if you think the technology itself was the real enemy. In 1942, the Boeing Company received one of the most ambitious and expensive contracts in American history, over $3 billion, to design and produce a bomber capable of reaching Japan from distant island bases. The Army Air Forces called it Project Superfortress, a weapon that would finally bring the war to the enemy's homeland. Inside the factories at Seattle, Wichita, and Marietta engineers spoke of it like a miracle of modern science. 4 giant Wright R3350 engines would lift the plane higher, farther, and faster than anything the world had ever seen. It would carry 10 tons of bombs across oceans, guided by analog computers, and manned by crews breathing pressurized air at 30,000 feet. To those who built it, the B-29 wasn't just an aircraft. It was the promise that American industry could outthink geography itself. But even miracles have flaws. The R3350 engine, the heart of this dream, was also its curse. On paper, it was a marvel of power, 18 cylinders arranged in twin rows, fuel injected for efficiency, turbo supercharged for altitude. In practice, the engine ran hotter than any other design ever tested. Its rear cylinders, packed tight behind the massive crankcase, received too little cooling air. The result was simple and deadly. Oil would carbonize, valves would warp, and within minutes of takeoff the temperature gauges would climb past the red line. At 300 degrees Celsius, lubricants would ignite. When they did, the entire nacelle turned into a furnace. Boeing's test pilots called it riding a bomb. In Wichita alone, more than 40 aircraft were lost to engine fires between early 1943 and mid-1944. The pattern was always the same takeoff, climb a flash of orange through the cowling, then the slow arc of a burning bomber falling back toward the ground. For every 10 B-29s produced, at least one was destroyed before it ever left American soil. A single training squadron lost half its aircraft in less than 6 months. Official reports describe the issue as localized overheating, a phrase that did nothing to comfort the men who had to fly them. Investigators from the Wright Aeronautical Corporation recommended stricter maintenance schedules, cleaner oil, and better airflow management. None of it worked. Engineers knew the truth but couldn't admit it publicly. The R3350's cooling system had been pushed beyond physical limits. The United States had rushed the engine into mass production before its flaws could be corrected. The war didn't allow for patience. The generals needed bombers now. The contradiction was stunning. America's most advanced aircraft was also its most dangerous. Each B-29 contained 350 000 individual parts, more than 1,000 feet of wiring and complex hydraulics that required 16 hours of maintenance for every hour of flight. The cost of one superfortress equaled that of 40 Sherman tanks. Yet its greatest weakness was invisible: a few inches of aluminum, a gap in airflow, a bureaucratic refusal to listen. In the humid heat of Wichita, production continued day and night. Women riveters in denim overalls sealed fuselages, while technicians checked pressure cabins and hydraulic lines. From the outside, it looked like a triumph of organization. Inside, tension was growing. Mechanics whispered about melted spark plugs, blistered pistons, and oil fires that sprayed burning fluid across the wings. They begged for redesigns. Larger baffles improved ducting any solution that might save lives. Each request met the same answer: not authorized, not in the manual. In Washington, Air Force procurement officers dismissed the complaints. They needed results, not excuses. The bomber must fly, one colonel declared. Every hour we delay costs American lives in the Pacific. That statement was both true and tragically ironic, because every flight test already cost lives. The contradiction became unbearable. Men working 12-hour shifts began to question what they were building. They were supposed to be saving airmen, not killing them. A few started keeping private notes sketching modifications they weren't allowed to make. The hangars filled with the smell of burned oil and aluminum dust. One supervisor later recalled, "We stopped cheering the takeoffs. We just waited for the smoke." The program was too big to stop, too expensive to fail. To admit that the B-29's engines were unsafe would have meant grounding the entire bomber offensive. Instead, production accelerated. By early 1944, the factories were producing 12 aircraft a day, each one a potential flying inferno. Amid that tension, a quiet revolution was forming on the factory floor. Mechanics began to share rumors about a young technician who refused to accept the official explanations. He claimed he'd found the real cause of the fires and was building a fix in secret. Most dismissed it as gossip. Others whispered that he might be right. Before we meet him, ask yourself something. If you saw a deadly flaw in a weapon your country depended on, would you risk your career to fix it? Comment 1 if you would, like if you'd follow the rules even when they're wrong. His name was Charles Red Dawson, a 29-year-old mechanic with grease permanently etched into the lines of his hands and a reputation for seeing what others missed. He wasn't a graduate engineer or a commissioned officer. He'd started as an apprentice in Wichita, fixing radial engines for mail planes before the war. By 1943, he was working 12 hours a day inside the engine test bay of the Boeing assembly plant, where the new B-29s were lined up like sleeping giants, their polished aluminum reflecting the yellow factory lights. Dawson's job was simple: on paper, inspect, maintain, sign off. But every time he watched a test flight return in flames, the simplicity dissolved. He began keeping notes in a small oil-stained notebook: temperatures, oil pressure, cylinder head readings. At first, he just wanted to understand why the R-3350 engines were failing. The patterns were unmistakable. The inner rear cylinders, numbers 15 through 18, always overheated first. The oil that was supposed to cool them circulated through passages too narrow for the heat load. In the cramped nacelle, air couldn't move freely. He drew a diagram, red penciling the airflow direction. The design forced hot air back toward the firewall instead of away from it. On his own time, Dawson began experimenting with airflow baffles, thin aluminum plates that directed cooling air around the cylinder fins. He widened the oil return line using scrap tubing from a grounded aircraft. He knew it was against regulation to modify anything without written approval, but watching another plane burn to the ground felt worse than breaking a rule. When he took his sketches to his supervisor, the response was instant and cold: not authorized. Wright Aeronautical sets the specs, not us. Dawson tried again, this time presenting the data a 20-degree drop in temperature after his mock-up test, using a fan and a single engine. The supervisor looked at the papers for 5 seconds, then slid them back across the desk. "I appreciate your enthusiasm, Red, but you're wasting your time. Nobody wants another redesign in the middle of a war." The words stuck in his mind: nobody wants. But what about the pilots who didn't get to want anything anymore? That night, as the rest of the factory went dark, Dawson stayed behind. The plant's metal skeleton echoed with the clang of distant tools. He opened the nacelle of a spare engine, mounted on a stand, the same model that had failed in half the crashes he'd investigated. Working by flashlight, he removed the lower cowling, unscrewed the heat baffles, and replaced the curved oil line with a handmade section that looked crude but allowed more flow. He adjusted the cowling flaps for a wider exit angle, a change of just a few degrees. Then he restarted the test fan. For 20 minutes, the engine roared under simulated load. The gauges held steady. No spikes, no flames, no smell of burning oil. The data showed a consistent drop of 40 degrees Celsius, enough to prevent ignition. Dawson stared at the gauges not with triumph but with fear. He had just committed an offense that could end his career and possibly land him in prison. Under wartime law, unauthorized modification of military hardware was considered a security violation. But what he had seen on those gauges wouldn't let him stop. In the following days, he quietly shared his findings with 2 other mechanics he trusted. Together, they modified one engine on a training aircraft scheduled for ground tests. They told the crew chief nothing. When the test run began, the R-3350 operated smoothly for 4 continuous hours without a single hot spot. The crew chief, unaware of the changes, signed off the engine as exceptional. For Dawson, that single word felt like proof that he might be saving lives. When he submitted another report, this time to the engineering division, it was ignored again. Paperwork vanished, signatures disappeared, and headquarters insisted that field adjustments were unnecessary. Dawson realized something deeper than mechanical failure was at work. The bureaucracy protecting the B-29 program had become its own enemy. The aircraft was too expensive to admit flawed. The generals couldn't risk delays, so they would rather risk men. He tried to stay silent, but the nightmares kept coming. Burning wings, screaming engines, the smell of hot oil. On July 3rd, another test crew died when a B-29 exploded over the Arkansas River. 14 men gone in seconds. Dawson had watched it happen from the tarmac. That night, he made his decision. If the system wouldn't change, he would. He began secretly reworking the engines scheduled for test flights, replacing the oil lines, and adjusting the cooling flaps whenever he could. He kept no records left, no signatures, just a small chalk mark under the nacelle. A single letter, R. Weeks later, pilots began noticing that some of the planes marked with the R ran cooler and smoother. They mentioned it in casual reports, no engine fire incidents. Word spread quietly among the maintenance crews. Find Red, they said. He knows something. By midsummer, rumors reached management. Dawson was summoned to the office. Did you authorize any modifications to government property? A colonel asked. Dawson didn't deny it. Yes, sir, he said. And if I hadn't, that bomber on runway 12 would be a crater right now. The colonel's face hardened. You realize that's a criminal admission? Dawson nodded. Then court-martial me after you look at the numbers. He handed over a page of temperature data recordings from engines before and after the modifications. The difference was too obvious to ignore. The colonel dismissed him without comment, but that night the same data was forwarded up the chain of command. Someone had finally started listening. Before we move on, consider this. Rules exist to keep order, but what happens when obeying them costs lives? Comment 1 if you think Dawson was right to act, like if you believe no individual should ever break military protocol no matter the reason. By late July 1944, the Wichita plant felt like a war zone of its own heat pressure and secrecy. Mechanics sweated over open engine bays while inspectors prowled the floor with clipboards recording every torque and signature. Somewhere among the rows of gleaming nacelles sat Dawson's secret. The modification was spreading, though no one knew who had started it. It wasn't in the manuals, not in the diagrams, and yet a handful of engines suddenly ran cooler, smoother, safer. The fix itself was deceptively simple, almost embarrassing in its elegance. The R-3350's problem wasn't power, it was airflow. The twin-row cylinders created a pressure trap that forced hot air to swirl instead of escape. The oil cooler placed behind the rear cylinders acted like a lid on a boiling pot. Dawson's design opened the pot. He had replaced the rigid oil line with a flexible S shape that allowed more surface area for heat transfer, and reduced back pressure on the oil pump. Then he widened the cowling exit flaps by 12 millimeters, just enough to let the exhaust air vent freely instead of recirculating. Finally, he installed a homemade deflector plate behind the magnetos, directing the cooling flow toward the hottest cylinders. It wasn't genius, it was common sense. But common sense was the one thing military bureaucracy rarely allowed. When headquarters learned that engines were being modified without written authorization, the reaction was swift. 2 military auditors arrived from Wright Aeronautical to investigate maintenance irregularities. Dawson was called in again, this time not by a colonel but by a board of officers. The hearing took place in a conference room above the factory floor where the air smelled of oil and sweat. An officer began reading from a regulation manual. "You are accused of unauthorized alteration of military equipment, a violation of Article 92 of the Army Air Force's Technical Manual. How do you plead?" Dawson didn't hesitate. "Guilty, sir. But I'd like to add that I've stopped 3 aircraft from catching fire." The room went silent. The chief engineer leaned forward. "Do you have proof?" Dawson reached into his tool bag and placed a small temperature gauge on the table, its needle frozen at 190 degrees Celsius, the reading from his modified engine under full load. The unmodified standard ran at 240. "That's all the proof I need," he said. The officers weren't convinced. Orders were orders, and no one wanted to take responsibility for approving an unsanctioned design change. But one of them, a young lieutenant from the engineering division, quietly asked for the blueprints of Dawson's changes. Purely for analysis, he said. That analysis would later save him and hundreds of others. A week later, an official test engine was scheduled for a controlled run. Unbeknownst to Dawson, the lieutenant had installed his modifications on one of the test nacelles. As the massive propeller spun up, the ground trembled. The temperature gauges began to climb. 150, 160, 180. Then they held steady. No smoke, no flames. Engineers stared at the readings. 4 hours later, the engine shut down perfectly clean. No hot spots, no burned oil. The test director frowned. "Run it again." They did. Same result. The improvement was undeniable. That night, word spread through the plant like wildfire. "The rogue mechanic was right," one engineer whispered. "He solved it." But officially nothing changed. The Army hadn't yet approved the fix, and until they did, the B-29S kept flying with the old configuration. Dawson knew that meant more deaths were coming. He went back to work quietly, focusing on planes scheduled for training missions. He and a small circle of trusted colleagues, known jokingly as Red's Raiders, continued installing the modifications at night. They marked the engine subtly, a small red stripe on the oil filler cap. Pilots didn't know what it meant, but they started to request those aircraft for test flights. "The red stripes don't burn," one of them said. Then came the confrontation Dawson had feared. A senior inspector caught him replacing a cowling panel after midnight. "That's not standard procedure," the man said, pointing to the modified baffles. "You're under investigation." Dawson was ordered off the floor pending review. His clearance was suspended. He spent 3 days in limbo watching through a window as new B-29S rolled out of the hangar, still carrying the unmodified engines he knew could explode. On the 4th day, everything changed. The test division received a direct order from Washington: evaluate alternative cooling configuration per Wichita report. No name was attached, no acknowledgement. But the design matched Dawson's exactly. Someone up the chain had quietly adopted his idea under a new label, Revision 3350 Cooling Mark III. The irony was painful. The change that might save the program now carried no trace of the man who had created it. Dawson returned to work as if nothing had happened. He wasn't thanked. He wasn't reprimanded. The only sign that anyone noticed was a quiet visit from the same lieutenant who'd tested his design. "We're flying one of your engines next week," he said. "I thought you'd want to know." That flight would become the defining moment of Dawson's life. A real B-29 fully loaded climbing into the Kansas sky to test the modified system. 4 engines, roaring temperatures, climbing every eye on the gauges. The pilots joked they'd brought parachutes just in case. But as the bomber reached 10,000 feet, the readings held steady. At 15,000, still stable. At 25,000 feet, the numbers barely moved. All engines normal. The radio crackled. For the first time in months, the phrase meant what it was supposed to mean. Dawson listened from the ground crew, truck fists clenched, heart pounding. When the bomber landed 2 hours later without a trace of smoke, the crew chief pulled off his headset and grinned. "Hell of a day to break a record," he said. The record was this: 0 engine fires. That night, Dawson walked alone across the empty hangar. The aircraft stood silent, their silver skins glowing under the arc lights. He knew his work had been stolen, renamed, buried in paperwork, but that didn't matter. Somewhere above, a crew had lived because he'd broken a rule. Before we continue, imagine being in his place. Would you risk your future, your freedom, to fix something no one else would admit was broken? Comment 1 if you would, like if you'd have followed the book and hoped for the best. The proving ground for every aircraft is not the test stand, but the sky. On the evening of August 8, 1944, a B-29 named Lucky Lady lifted from the Wichita runway on what was supposed to be a routine endurance flight. It was one of 12 bombers fitted with the new cooling Mark III configuration, Dawson's unauthorized fix now quietly sanctioned under another name. The air was still the sun dipping low over the Kansas plains, turning the polished fuselage into a streak of gold. Inside the cockpit, Major Frank Ellison, a veteran test pilot, adjusted the throttle levers, his eyes sweeping over the engine gauges. All readings were normal. 4 Wright R3350S thundered in perfect rhythm. At 12,000 feet, the aircraft turned south to begin the high-power climb sequence. The flight engineer, Lieutenant Sam Carter, monitored the temperature gauges on the right-hand console. 4 dials, 1 for each engine, glowing amber in the fading light. The second engine, number 2, had always been the troublemaker, the one most prone to fires. At first, everything looked steady. Then, at 15,000 feet, Carter frowned. Captain number 2's climbing, 220 and rising. Ellison leaned forward, squinting. "Keep an eye on it." The smell hit next hot oil, sharp and bitter, the scent every B-29 crewman feared. In the radio compartment, the operator's hands froze above his controls. He'd heard that smell before, and it always ended with flames. "Sir, she's smoking." A thin trail of vapor curled back along the wing, faint but visible in the slanting sun. The alarm light flickered on the panel oil pressure drop. Engine 2. The intercom filled with voices, calm but tight. "Feather number 2. Stand by, don't panic yet. Oil pressure's dropping fast." The crew's breathing grew louder in the headsets. Ellison made the decision. "Feather 2. Fuel off, fire suppression armed." Carter pulled the lever. The propeller blades shifted to the feathered position, cutting drag, and a burst of carbon dioxide hissed through the nacelle. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the alarm light went dark. The smoke faded. Temperature dropped. The engine had shut down cleanly. No explosion. No fire. Silence filled the cabin except for the deep hum of the remaining 3 engines. Ellison exhaled slowly. "All right, let's bring her home." The radio operator transmitted the report: test aircraft experiencing engine shutdown, no fire returning to base. On the ground, Dawson was already there, standing near the runway with a clipboard and a stopwatch. He'd been following the telemetry feeds from the test range. The moment the oil temperature spiked, his stomach turned to stone. He knew that reading too well. But when the gauges leveled off and the word "no fire" came through the line, he closed his eyes. It had worked. 25 minutes later, Lucky Lady came in on final approach, the evening light flashing across her wings. Mechanics lined the taxiway, watching silently. The bomber rolled to a stop, engines 1, 3, and 4 idling evenly. Dawson climbed the ladder and entered the aircraft. The crew was unbuckling faces, pale hands trembling. The engineer handed him the log sheet. Number 2 hit 270 degrees before shutdown. never flamed. Dawson nodded. He ran his fingers over the still warm cowling, feeling the faint vibration of life beneath the aluminum. That vibration meant victory. In the debrief room, the data spoke louder than any speech could. The modified system had contained an engine failure without combustion. The oil flow reroute prevented blowback into the exhaust manifold, the exact trigger that had caused dozens of fatal fires. The improved airflow carried the heat away, and the widened exit flaps vented the excess pressure before ignition could occur. In raw numbers, the risk of catastrophic fire had dropped by nearly 90%. What had been a statistical death sentence for every 10th flight had become a survivable malfunction. Over the next 6 weeks, 11 more aircraft equipped with the same configuration completed extended missions without a single incident. For the first time since production began, the maintenance logs for fire in flight showed 0 entries. A quiet revolution was underway, hidden behind official phrases like technical improvement and revision standardization. No one in the public would ever know the story. To the Air Force, it was just another line item in a report. But to the men who flew the B-29, it was the difference between life and death. In September, one of those aircraft, City of Wichita, took off on a record-breaking endurance flight, 32 hours in the air engines, running continuously, covering nearly 5,000 miles. The press called it proof of American superiority. None of them knew that the system keeping those engines alive had begun as a band modification scribbled in a mechanic's notebook. By the fall of 1944, the data was undeniable. Fire-related losses dropped from 1 per 13 flights to 1 per several hundred. Pilots began trusting their machines again. Crews no longer flinched at the smell of hot oil. The bomber that had once been cursed was becoming the cornerstone of victory. Dawson remained a ghost in the paperwork. His name appeared nowhere in the official memos. The cooling Mark III design was credited to a committee at Wright Aeronautical, which conveniently left blank how the idea originated. He didn't care. Each time a B-29 roared overhead without smoke trailing from its wings, he felt his own quiet reward. But even triumph carries its shadows. That winter, another B-29 caught fire over the Pacific after an enemy hit. The crew's final radio transmission echoed through static. At least it wasn't the engine. For the first time, the disaster hadn't been mechanical. The impossible had become routine. That night, standing under the orange glow of the hangar lights, Dawson realized he had changed something far bigger than an airplane. He had proved that courage wasn't only found in the cockpit. Sometimes it lived in the silence of a workshop, in the hands of a man who refused to accept that good enough was good enough. If you believe that real heroism can happen far from the battlefield, comment 1 below. Like if you think the world only remembers the men who fight, not those who make fighting possible. 3 weeks after the Lucky Lady test flight, Charles Red Dawson was called once again to the administrative office above the Wichita factory floor. The same corridor that had once echoed with accusations now felt different, quiet, tense, almost reverent. On the wall outside the conference room hung a single framed photograph. A B-29 lifting into the morning sky, 4 engines blazing evenly, no smoke, no fire. Beneath it was a small brass plate stamped with 3 words, Cooling Mark III, approved. Dawson stared at it for a long moment before knocking on the door. Inside, 3 officers were waiting, a colonel from Wright Aeronautical, a legal representative from the Army Air Forces, and a civilian engineer whose white shirt was stained with graphite. None of them smiled. The colonel gestured to a chair. "Sit down, Mr. Dawson." Papers rustled. "You're aware of the charges previously brought against you, unauthorized modification of military hardware, insubordination, and violation of the Technical Compliance Act." Dawson nodded. "Yes, sir." The colonel leaned back. "Before we continue, I have one question. Did you invent the system now designated Cooling Mark III? He hesitated. If he said yes, he'd be admitting guilt again. If he said no, the truth would die. He took a breath. "I did, sir. But I didn't invent it to disobey orders. I did it because the orders were killing people. The colonel didn't answer right away. He flipped through the folder on the table test results, flight data, field reports. After several minutes of silence, he said, almost softly, "You realize that this design has reduced in-flight fire incidents by 94%, Dawson nodded. Then you also realize it has saved more lives than any decision this board has made all year. The colonel closed the folder and pushed it aside. Effective immediately, all charges are dismissed. The matter is officially resolved. It was over just like that. No apology, no medals, no ceremony. Dawson had imagined punishment, maybe disgrace, but not this empty kind of victory. Sir, if I may ask, he said quietly, what happens now? The colonel's answer was the language of bureaucracy, precise and detached. Your modifications have been absorbed into the production standard. You'll be reassigned to the technical validation team for the remainder of the fiscal year. Then his tone softened. You'll understand, of course, that none of this can appear in the public record. Wartime secrecy. We can't have the press reporting that a mechanic saved the program. It would raise questions about oversight. Dawson nodded again. He wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or insulted. He was free but invisible. After the meeting, he walked back through the assembly line. Rows of unfinished B-29S stood under the arc lights, like sleeping steel giants. Mechanics were installing the new cooling baffles, the very same design he'd built from scrap metal months earlier. The difference was that now it was legal. One of the younger workers, not recognizing him, waved a wrench and said proudly, "You see this new setup? They say it fixes the fires. Real genius work from the top brass." Dawson smiled faintly and didn't correct him. He didn't need to. A week later, a telegram arrived from Washington. It wasn't a commendation, not officially. It was a reclassification notice. Mr. Charles Dawson, promotion to Senior Technical Supervisor effective immediately. Assignment Quality Control Engine Division, Wichita. At the bottom, in smaller type, was a single handwritten note. Well done. H.A. The initials belonged to General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Forces. Someone at the very top had noticed after all. The recognition changed nothing about Dawson's life. He still drove the same truck, wore the same oil-stained coveralls, ate lunch in the same cafeteria. But he carried a quiet satisfaction that no medal could match. Each time he heard the thunder of 4 R-3350 engines overhead, he felt it not pride exactly, but something steadier, peace. By the winter of 1944, the modified B-29S were arriving in the Pacific by the hundreds. They took off from bases in the Marianas, crossing open ocean for 10 hours at a time, bomb bays loaded with destruction. The old fear, the sudden flash of fire, the desperate bailout had vanished. Maintenance logs recorded unprecedented reliability. For every 100 sorties, less than one was lost to engine malfunction. Commanders called it a miracle of engineering, though none could name the man who had made it possible. In one combat report from the 498th Bomb Group, a flight engineer noted, "Engine 2 lost pressure over Iwo Jima. Shut down clean, no flame, returned to base." Another crew member scrawled in the margin, "That new system works. Whoever thought it up, he saved a lot of necks." Dawson kept those copies. Someone had mailed them to him anonymously from the field. He folded the papers carefully and placed them in his tool chest between the wrenches and a faded photograph of his crew from the early days. A year later, as victory celebrations erupted across America, a local newspaper published a feature on unsung heroes of the war industry. One small paragraph mentioned a Wichita mechanic whose innovative maintenance procedures contributed to the reliability of the B-29. It didn't mention his name. Dawson cut the article out and pinned it to the wall of his workshop. That was enough. The Air Force never issued him a decoration. But in 1946, when he left Boeing for civilian life, his colleagues pooled their money to buy him a brass plaque engraved with a single line, "He fixed the fire." Looking back years later, Dawson told a reporter who finally tracked him down, "I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was just tired of watching good men burn. They called it illegal, but I called it necessary. If you agree that courage doesn't always wear a uniform or stand in the spotlight, comment 1 below. Like if you believe history forgets too many of the people who actually make it. In the spring of 1945, the roar of the B-29 filled the skies of the Pacific like thunder, rolling over an endless sea. The aircraft that once terrified its own crews had become the most reliable heavy bomber in the world. At the heart of that transformation was a set of small aluminum baffles, a rerouted oil line, and the courage of one mechanic who refused to look away. The Air Force called it a systems improvement. The men who flew called it salvation. From the island runways of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, waves of B-29s took off daily, each one carrying more than 10 tons of bombs toward Japan's cities and factories. The missions were brutal 15-hour round trips through storms, turbulence, and enemy fire, but now they were survivable. The records told the story clearly. Before the new cooling system, nearly 1 in every 10 B-29s was lost to engine failure or fire. After the change, the number dropped to less than 1 in 100. The difference was more than statistics. It meant fathers came home, crews lived to fly another day, and the bomber offensive that crushed Japan's war industry could continue without collapsing under its own mechanical flaws. When the first atomic missions were flown from Tinian, the aircraft Enola Gay and Boxcar both carried the Mark III cooling system. Dawson's fingerprints, though long erased from the paperwork, were in every bolt and oil line. The engines that powered those missions ran perfectly, maintaining temperature and pressure all the way from takeoff to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world changed forever in those moments, but behind the politics and devastation lay the quiet fact that the planes had made it because a factory mechanic once broke the rules. After the war, the B-29 remained in service for years. It fought again in Korea, where its engines still carried Dawson's modifications, now fully integrated into production as standard design. The R-3350, once cursed as a killer of pilots, became the most produced radial engine in American history. Its descendants powered commercial airliners into the 1950s, from the Lockheed Constellation to the Douglas DC-7. Every one of them owed their reliability to that forgotten breakthrough. Dawson never spoke publicly about what he had done. He returned to civilian life, opened a small machine shop on the outskirts of Wichita, and hired a few younger mechanics fresh out of the service. His shop's motto, hand-painted above the door, read, "Do it right, or do it again." When asked about the war, he would simply say, "I built engines that finally stopped killing their crews." Those who knew him said he never bragged, never sought credit, and never kept any photographs of himself beside the B-29s he'd helped save. But history, as it often does, began to rediscover him decades later. In 1978, an aviation historian named Harold King stumbled across internal memos from 1944 referencing an unnamed field engineer who had solved the overheating issue independently. King tracked down former Boeing workers who still remembered Red Dawson, the stubborn mechanic with the red stripe mark under the nacelles. When King published his findings in Air Power Quarterly, the story reached a new generation of pilots and engineers. The headline read, "The Man Who Fixed the Fortress." For the first time, Dawson's name appeared where it belonged. He never saw the article. Dawson had passed away a year earlier quietly in the same town where he'd been born. At his funeral, a retired B-29 pilot placed a small brass plaque on his casket. It read simply, "He kept us flying." Today, every surviving B-29 that appears at air shows still carries the DNA of his work. When the engines start and the deep thunder of 4 R-3350s rolls across the tarmac, that sound is more than nostalgia. It's the echo of one man's defiance. The heat that once killed now flows safely away, the flames extinguished by an act of courage buried beneath the metal. In the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, there's a small display case beside the gleaming fuselage of a restored superfortress. Inside it sits a battered oil line and a temperature gauge locked at 190 degrees Celsius. the very gauge Dawson showed at his hearing. The plaque below reads, "From violation to validation." Innovation begins with courage. Visitors rarely notice it, but for those who know the story, it is more powerful than any medal. The legacy of Charles Red Dawson is not about heroism in the traditional sense. It's about responsibility, about what happens when a single person decides that silence is no longer an option. He didn't invent the bomb or the engine or the war. He simply refused to accept that death was an acceptable side effect of paperwork. His crime was compassion, his punishment was anonymity, and his reward was the sound of engines that no longer burned. As the decades pass, the lessons of his defiance remain. Every innovation, every safety system, every design improvement owes something to people like him. The nameless mechanics, engineers, and technicians who act not for glory but because they cannot bear to watch preventable tragedy. So when you hear the roar of a vintage B-29 overhead, remember the man who bent the rules to save the men who flew it. Remember that history's greatest victories aren't always won by generals or politicians, but by ordinary people with extraordinary conviction. If you believe that real change comes from those willing to challenge the system for what's right, comment one below. Like if you think the world still needs people brave enough to say the book is wrong. And if you want to hear more hidden stories of courage that history almost erased, subscribe to the channel because sometimes the smallest idea, the most forbidden idea, is the one that keeps the world alive.